The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, a three-chapter conclusion. Karl Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written in 1852, stands as one of the most brilliant political analyses in modern history. Marx did not merely describe events, he dissected them with the sharp precision of a philosopher and the investigative depth of a historian. The title refers to a specific date in the French revolutionary calendar, the day Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799. Marx used this symbolic date to examine the political rise of Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, later Napoleon III, who staged his own coup d'état in 1851. Marx's aim was not simply to report what happened, but to explain why it happened and how political forces, classes, and economic conditions shaped this turning point in French history. This book begins with a gripping sense of suspense. How did a seemingly unimpressive man like Louis Bonaparte manage to overthrow a republic that had just survived a revolution? How do societies repeat old mistakes? And why does history sometimes come back wearing a different mask? Marx famously wrote that history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. In the case of France, the tragedy was the rise of Napoleon I, the farce was the rise of his nephew. This three-chapter conclusion captures the heart of Marx's argument while presenting it in clear, engaging USA English suitable for both general listeners and experts. It preserves factual accuracy while maintaining narrative flow perfect for reading, teaching, or recording as audio. Chapter 1, France after the Revolution, a nation searching for stability. France in the years following the Revolution of 1848 was a nation suspended between memory and possibility, a place where the past refused to die, and the future struggled to be born. Karl Marx, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, paints this moment with exceptional clarity. He shows us a society shaken to its core, not just by political events but by deeper social tensions that had been building for decades. To understand why Louis Bonaparte eventually rose to power, a man many of his contemporaries dismissed as mediocre, uninspiring, and even foolish, we must understand the France he exploited. This France was restless, fractured, and hungry for stability. Let us begin with the emotional and psychological landscape. The revolution of 1848 had erupted like a storm. Crowds filled the streets of Paris, barricades went up overnight, and the monarchy of Louis Philippe collapsed under the pressure of public anger, economic crisis, and widespread disillusionment. People believed the new republic would deliver jobs, security, democratic rights, and perhaps even a more just economic order. But reality fell far short of expectations. The republic was created in excitement, but within months it was sinking into confusion and competing interests. Marx makes a crucial point: revolutions do not start with clear plans, but they awaken powerful forces that no one fully controls. In 1848, workers demanded social reforms, peasants demanded lower taxes, the bourgeoisie demanded order, the old aristocracy demanded a return to tradition, and radicals demanded a complete restructuring of society. The Second Republic was trying to satisfy all these groups at the same time, a difficult task in any era, but nearly impossible given the volatile atmosphere. Economically, France was in trouble. Industrialization was transforming cities but leaving many workers unemployed or underpaid. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were struggling beneath the weight of long-standing debts and taxes. The economy was fragile, and every political shock made it worse. When people fear uncertainty, they often look for a savior, sometimes even in unlikely figures. This is where the story of Louis Bonaparte begins to connect with the story of France's desperation. But before introducing him, we must understand the deeper layers Marx emphasizes. France wasn't just in crisis because of economic hardship. It was in crisis because the revolution of 1848 had created a gap between ideals and institutions, between the hopes of the people and the machinery of the state. The Republic proclaimed equality and universal male suffrage, but the actual governing bodies were controlled by the property-owning classes. The parliament was dominated by people who feared the workers, mistrusted the peasants, and disliked the revolutionary clubs and societies that had grown in Paris. This tension eventually exploded in the June days of 1848, one of the most violent moments in the 19th century. Workers in Paris rose in rebellion after the government shut down the national workshops, an employment program designed to help the poor. The uprising was crushed with brutal force. Thousands were killed, arrested, or exiled. The message was clear: the bourgeois republic would tolerate democracy, but not social revolution. Marx saw the June days as the turning point that shaped everything that followed. It created a deep divide between the working class and the ruling classes, a divide that Louis Bonaparte would later exploit masterfully. By 1849, the Second Republic was surrounded by contradictions. It claimed to represent all citizens equally, yet its policies favored the wealthy. It spoke of liberty, yet it repressed dissent. It promised stability, yet it could not control the political chaos inside its own chambers. Each class mistrusted the others. The bourgeoisie feared another uprising like the June days. The workers felt betrayed by a republic that had claimed to speak for them. The peasants, isolated in rural regions, were uncertain whom to support. The aristocracy looked backward with nostalgic longing for the monarchy. And the radical Democrats, scattered but vocal, demanded reforms that frightened nearly everyone else. In this chaotic landscape, democracy ironically created further instability. Universal male voting gave political power to the peasants, a group less connected to the ideological battles of the cities. They were not deeply aware of the daily struggles between workers and capitalists. They did not attend political clubs. They were focused on land, taxes, and survival. And they remembered the name Bonaparte. Napoleon I may have been a conqueror to some, but to many peasants he symbolized security, patriotism, and strong leadership. His legacy lived in folk stories, songs, old medals, and memories of national glory. Louis Bonaparte understood this sentimental attachment. He was not a brilliant statesman, nor a great orator, nor a visionary thinker. But he understood the symbolic power of his name, and he packaged it into a political image that appealed to millions of rural voters. He presented himself as the guardian of order, the protector of the common man, and the heir of Napoleon, not in military might, but in national unity. Marx cleverly describes him as a man who resembled a shadow of his uncle, imitating gestures he barely understood, yet benefiting from their emotional impact. When Louis Bonaparte ran for president in December 1848, he shocked the political elites by winning with an overwhelming majority thanks largely to peasant support. Marx argues that the ruling classes underestimated him because they viewed him through a narrow lens, as an uninspiring figure lacking charisma, intellect, or political talent. They did not realize that his very dullness was his advantage. He appeared harmless, manageable, and moderate, the kind of man the bourgeoisie believed they could control. But the masses saw something different. They saw a symbol, a legacy, a familiar name wrapped in promises of stability. Once elected, Bonaparte began navigating the divided political landscape with cautious strategy. The National Assembly, France's legislature, was dominated by conservatives, royalists, and bourgeois representatives who believed they held the real power. They expected the president to follow their lead. Bonaparte pretended to do so at first, but slowly he began constructing his own power base. He dismissed officials loyal to parliament, appointed loyal supporters to key positions, and strengthened his influence over the army and police. These actions were subtle at first, so subtle that many deputies did not recognize the danger until it was too late. Here, Marx introduces one of his most insightful ideas: the weakness of the ruling classes often creates opportunities for ambitious individuals. The National Assembly, despite its legal authority, was divided within itself. Monarchists wanted a king but could not agree on which royal family should rule the Bourbons or the Orleans line. Conservatives feared radicalism more than dictatorship. The bourgeoisie wanted stability more than genuine democracy. This fragmentation prevented them from acting decisively. Meanwhile, Bonaparte slowly cultivated support from groups that felt ignored or threatened by parliament. He targeted the peasants by simplifying political messages and promising tax relief. He targeted workers by presenting himself as an outsider to parliamentary elites. He targeted the army by appealing to their pride and restoring elements of military symbolism tied to the Napoleonic legacy. France during these years resembled a theater where actors played their roles without understanding the full script. Parliament debated endlessly but achieved little. Factions fought for influence but weakened themselves through infighting. Bonaparte, watching from the sidelines, positioned himself as the calm figure above the turmoil, a man promising unity in a time of discord. Marx explains this psychological dynamic with remarkable clarity. People who feel exhausted by political chaos can become easy prey for authoritarian solutions. They start believing that a strong leader, even a flawed one, is better than endless conflict. This does not happen suddenly, it grows slowly through disillusionment, disappointment, and fear. By 1851, France was weary. The Republic no longer inspired hope. The legislature was mistrusted. The political class seemed incapable of governing. Social tensions threatened new uprisings. The situation was ripe for someone to step in and declare, "Enough. I will restore order." Louis Bonaparte was preparing exactly that. But before the coup of 1851, which Marx analyzes in breathtaking detail, Chapter 1 ends by recognizing the deeper irony at the heart of this history: revolutions can create openings for counter-revolutions, and republics can unintentionally empower future dictators. The Second Republic, with all its ideals, political experiments, and democratic mechanisms, created the very conditions that allowed its own destruction. France after 1848 was not simply unstable, it was divided along class lines, ideological lines, generational lines, and economic lines. These fractures did not cancel each other out, they reinforced one another. And in this maze of contradictions, Louis Bonaparte found the perfect environment to rise, not through genius, but through opportunity. Marx warns us that history does not move smoothly. It swings, recoils, stumbles, and sometimes repeats itself, not because people fail to remember, but because social structures, economic pressures, and class relations create similar outcomes in different eras. France wanted stability; instead, it drifted toward authoritarianism. It wanted democracy; Instead, it elected a man who would later crush the Republic. It wanted progress, instead, it fell back into old patterns. This is where Chapter 1 concludes, with France standing at the edge of a transformation it did not fully recognize, led by a man most believed was incapable of changing history. Yet Marx shows that even the least impressive individuals can rise when society is unbalanced, distracted, and divided. Louis Bonaparte was not the cause of France's instability, he was the beneficiary of it. Chapter 2, The Rival Classes and Their Struggle for Power. If Chapter 1 revealed the fragile landscape of post-revolutionary France, then Chapter 2 opens the doors to the real engine behind Marx's analysis, the struggle between social classes. Marx does not treat history as a sequence of random events or heroic personalities. For him, politics is the visible surface of deeper, invisible conflicts. And in the case of France between 1848 and 1851, these conflicts were intense, unpredictable, and often misunderstood by the people living through them. To understand how Louis Bonaparte rose to power, we must journey into these rivalries, the battles not only in the streets and the parliament but inside the very structure of society. Think of France as a complex machine in which different groups pulled levers, pressed buttons, and turned wheels, each trying to steer the direction of the nation. Yet the more they fought, the more they weakened each other, leaving a vacuum for someone else to seize control. Marx identifies four major forces shaping the destiny of the Second Republic. 1. The bourgeoisie. 2. The working class, the proletariat. 3. The peasantry. 4. The old aristocracy, particularly the Legitimists and Orleanists. Each of these forces had its own interests, fears, and vision of France. But none of them could unite the country. Their conflicts form the heart of this chapter and ultimately explain how Louis Bonaparte outmaneuvered them all. 1. The bourgeoisie, the rulers who feared their own republic. At first glance, the bourgeoisie seemed to dominate everything. They were the wealthy property owners, industrialists, bankers, major merchants, and influential professionals. They controlled most newspapers, most businesses, and large parts of the political system. When the monarchy collapsed in 1848, they supported the creation of a republic, but not because they believed in liberty or equality. They supported it because a republic seemed safer than a monarchy that might tax them excessively or displease their economic interests. Here lies one of Marx's sharp observations: the bourgeoisie wanted the form of democracy without the consequences of democracy. They wanted universal voting, but only if the voters selected candidates who protected property and profit. They wanted freedom of speech, but not for radicals. They wanted a modern state, but not one that interfered with their wealth. This contradiction haunted them. Every time the Republic empowered workers or peasants, the bourgeoisie panicked. Every time the government tried to impose law and order, the workers panicked. The ruling class, despite holding the institutions, lived in constant fear of uprisings, fear of socialism, fear of the people themselves. A government rooted in fear cannot govern with confidence. The bourgeoisie's anxiety made them harsh, reactionary, and ultimately self-defeating. The National Assembly, dominated by bourgeois and conservative politicians, passed restrictive laws against clubs, public gatherings, and working-class organizations. They suppressed newspapers, limited political expression, and created a police environment that suffocated the spirit of democracy. Instead of stabilizing France, they alienated the groups they needed most. Marx describes this behavior with biting irony, a ruling class that had achieved power, yet could not rule. To the working class, betrayed, silenced, but unbroken. The working class of Paris had been the driving force behind the revolution of 1848. They believed passionately, sincerely that the fall of the monarchy would bring dignity, better wages, and a voice in society. For a brief moment, their hopes seemed possible. The national workshops gave them work. Political clubs gave them representation. The revolutionary spirit gave them faith. But the bourgeois republic quickly betrayed these hopes. The national workshops were shut down. Workers were dismissed as dangerous agitators. Parliament passed laws aimed at limiting their influence. And when the workers rose in protest during the June days, the government responded with brutal violence. Thousands were killed or imprisoned. The republic that claimed to speak for the people destroyed the most courageous portion of the people. This betrayal left deep wounds. Workers withdrew from politics out of necessity, exhaustion, or fear. Many leaders were dead or in exile. Clubs were banned. Newspapers were censored. The voices of the working class were pushed underground. Yet Marx reminds us that silencing a class does not erase it. The workers remained a constant pressure beneath the surface of force that frightened the bourgeoisie and influenced every political calculation. The National Assembly bowed and bent not because workers were active, but because their past actions had shown their potential. This tension between bourgeois fear and working class frustration created a constant instability. And Louis Bonaparte understood this perfectly. He pretended to be sympathetic to the working class, using vague promises of social reform to attract their support. He spoke simply, avoiding the complex economic ideas of socialist thinkers, but he delivered his messages in a tone that sounded friendly to the poor. He made himself seem like the people's president, even while preparing to suppress them later. But at this stage, his strategy worked. The working class, despite being politically crushed, saw in him an alternative to the bourgeois politicians who had betrayed them. In one of Marx's most striking insights, he notes that Bonaparte manipulated the aspirations of the poor without offering them real change. His promises were empty, but they were enough to unsettle the existing rulers. 3. The peasantry, the sleeping giant of French politics. Perhaps the most important class numerically and politically was the peasantry, which made up nearly 3/4 of the French population. The peasants lived in villages far from the ideological battles of Paris. They did not attend political clubs or read newspapers. They rarely saw government officials. Their concerns were immediate and practical. Taxes, harvest yields, land ownership, debts to money lenders, church rituals, local disputes. To them, the Republic was an abstract idea. The Parliament was distant. The Revolution was a rumor carried on wind from Paris. The bourgeoisie misunderstood the peasants. They assumed peasants would simply support conservative interests. Socialists misunderstood them too. They believed peasants would naturally join workers in a united front for justice. But peasants were neither conservative nor socialist. They were, in Marx's words, a class fragmented into millions of small lives, each isolated on its own piece of land. What they lacked was a unifying idea. Louis Bonaparte gave them one, or rather, he gave them a memory, the legacy of Napoleon. The peasants admired Napoleon not for his wars, but for what they believed he symbolized. protection from aristocrats, defense of property rights, stability, strong leadership. Napoleon had restructured rural France, protected small landowners, and granted many peasants access to land through reforms. Whether these memories were accurate or exaggerated did not matter. They were powerful. And Louis Bonaparte, by sharing the same name, inherited this collective nostalgia. Marx brilliantly captures the psychology at work. Peasants voted for Bonaparte because they saw him not as a politician, but as a mythical figure, the return of a past they believed had been safer and more just. Bonaparte understood this deeply. He visited rural areas, acted humble, made flashy but vague promises, and presented himself as the friend of the common man. As a result, peasants gave him overwhelming political power, so overwhelming that it frightened the ruling class in Paris. For the aristocracy, a ghost of the past still influencing the present. The old aristocracy, the Legitimists and the Orleanists, wanted a king back on the throne, but they disagreed on which dynasty should rule. Their power had been declining for decades. Many still owned large estates and commanded respect locally. But politically, they were divided, bitter, and often out of touch. Their most significant impact came through the National Assembly, where they formed a strong conservative bloc. They pushed for strict laws, censorship, and a return to Catholic influence. Yet they failed to inspire the broader population. Even many bourgeois politicians preferred a republic over a king. Their internal rivalry further weakened them. Because they could not unite, they could not lead. Their nostalgia for monarchy blinded them to the realities of modern France. And most critically, they underestimated Louis Bonaparte. They supported him as president because they believed he could be managed and controlled until a proper king could return. This was a fatal mistake. Five-class conflict creates a vacuum and Bonaparte steps in. As Marx describes it, the political battlefield of France became a chaotic arena. The bourgeoisie ruled but feared the people. The workers were beaten down but remained a symbol of what the elite feared. The peasants held massive electoral power but lacked political organization. The aristocracy dreamed of the past while failing in the present. Every group was either fighting itself or fighting others. No class was strong enough to dominate. No class was wise enough to compromise. And this is where Marx's analysis becomes both brilliant and chilling. When classes are busy fighting one another, they become vulnerable to an outsider who claims to rise above the conflict. Louis Bonaparte positioned himself exactly this way. He told the bourgeoisie he would protect property. He told workers he would bring social reform. He told peasants he was the heir of Napoleon. He told the army he would restore its honor. He was everything to everyone and nothing to anyone. This ambiguity was his strength. It allowed him to gather support from multiple sides without committing to any of them. Marx compares him to a clown performing in a political circus, not because he was foolish, but because he played so many roles while never revealing his true intent. His mediocrity, as Marx calls it, made him unpredictable. He was not bound by ideology. He was not loyal to any class. He played groups against each other, exploiting their weaknesses. As each class tried to use Bonaparte for its own advantage, he used them instead. By the time they realized what was happening, his support network had spread across the countryside, the military, the police, and the lower classes. 6. The stage is set for the final act. At the end of chapter 2, France is a nation exhausted by class conflict. The Republic is weakened. The National Assembly is divided. The people are disillusioned. The political elite is blind to the danger. Marx leaves us with a powerful message: when society is divided, a charismatic or symbolic leader can rise not because he is great, but because everyone else is weak. Louis Bonaparte was not a genius, but he had opportunity. He did not possess brilliance, but he possessed timing. And the classes of France, through their rivalries, fears, and mistakes, handed him the tools he needed. By 1851, the final confrontation was approaching, and Bonaparte prepared to strike the decisive blow. Chapter 3, The Coup of 1851. How Louis Bonaparte seized the state. The story of Louis Bonaparte's rise reaches its climax in December 1851, a moment Karl Marx examines with surgical clarity. It was the moment when a man dismissed as unremarkable, a political lightweight, performed one of the most audacious acts in modern European history, the overthrow of the Second Republic. But Marx insists this was not a story of one man's genius. It was the story of a fractured nation, divided classes, and institutions that crumbled under their own contradictions. This chapter begins where the last ended, with a republic weakened by infighting, a parliament rich with privilege but poor in unity, and a president silently tightening his grip. Louis Bonaparte was waiting for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, the fall of the Republic was swift, dramatic, and almost surreal. To truly appreciate the coup, we must first understand the slow-motion drama leading up to it. Politics did not collapse in a single night, it unraveled piece by piece, like a rope snapping thread by thread. Won the presidency that grew too large for the Republic. Louis Bonaparte was elected president in 1848 with a landslide victory. The Constitution allowed only one 4-year term, with no immediate re-election. This limitation was designed to prevent another Napoleon-style dictatorship. Ironically, it pushed Bonaparte toward exactly that outcome. By 1851, he had a problem. His popularity was still high among peasants and many workers. But he was constitutionally barred from staying in power. The National Assembly refused to amend the Constitution to let him run again. They distrusted him, mocked him privately, and tried to weaken his influence. But Marx notes a fascinating irony: the more they tried to weaken the president, the more they exposed their own weakness. Bonaparte understood something they did not. People preferred a single man who promised order over a parliament that endlessly argued. As the assembly cut his powers on paper, he increased his powers in practice. He toured the countryside, staged public ceremonies, met with military officers, and surrounded himself with loyalists. He created a myth: the humble hero of the people, the savior of rural France, the one man strong enough to resist parliamentary chaos. Every time he clashed with the assembly, his popularity grew. The politicians looked petty, he looked presidential. This was not accidental. It was strategy. To the National Assembly's fatal mistakes. If Louis Bonaparte outplayed the political elite, it was partly because the elite were busy outplaying one another. The assembly was a battlefield of competing factions: monarchists, bourgeois liberals, conservative Catholics, moderate Republicans, and even a scattered bloc of radicals. They hated Bonaparte, but they hated each other even more. Marx describes them as a house divided against itself. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is political diagnosis. Their mistakes were many. Mistake 1: they underestimated Bonaparte. They believed he lacked intelligence and courage. They assumed he would bow before them. They thought they were pulling the strings. Instead, they were giving him time. Mistake 2, they stripped him of ceremonial powers. This angered the public, who saw the assembly as bullying the elected president. Mistake 3, they alienated the army. Officers disliked the assembly's disrespect toward Bonaparte. Soldiers admired the Napoleonic name. The assembly didn't realize it was losing the only institution capable of protecting it. Mistake 4, they repressed workers and radicals. This created an image of the assembly as forceful, elitist, and disconnected, while Bonaparte remained closer to the people. Mistake 5, they tried to revive monarchy but couldn't agree on a king. Two royal families competed for the throne. The assembly spent months in petty arguments while Bonaparte built a loyal machine ready for action. Marx's verdict is harsh but accurate: the assembly defeated itself long before Bonaparte moved against it. 3. The tools of power are prepared behind the scenes. A coup doesn't happen magically. It requires preparation, secrecy, timing, and loyal forces. Louis Bonaparte spent months building exactly that. He placed loyalists in key posts: the police, the Paris garrison, the National Guard, administrative offices across France. He used the presidency to reward loyal officers and marginalize opponents. He also cultivated a personal guard, a mix of military units and loyal police forces who were ready to act quickly. At the same time, he created a narrative that he was the people's defender, the victim of parliamentary scheming, and the only man who could save France from another revolution. This narrative mattered. A coup is easier when people believe you are protecting them rather than attacking the government. Marx points out something subtle but essential: the bourgeois politicians trusted the constitution, Bonaparte trusted the streets, the barracks, and the emotions of the masses. One believes in paper. The other believes in power. History often favors the latter. 4 December 2, 1851 the coup unfolds. On the cold morning of December 2, 1851, the anniversary of Napoleon I's coronation and his victory at Austerlitz, Louis Bonaparte struck. Just before dawn, Paris awoke to soldiers marching through the streets. Posters and proclamations appeared on walls, their ink barely dry. In one stroke, Bonaparte dissolved the National Assembly, abolished universal suffrage restrictions imposed by the Assembly, arrested the Assembly's most influential leaders, deployed troops throughout Paris to prevent rebellion, declared a state of emergency. The streets were lined with bayonets. Newspapers were seized. Telegraph offices were occupied. Key political opponents were taken from their beds before sunrise. It was theatrical, precise, and shockingly effective. Why? Because the assembly had no army loyal enough to defend it. The parliamentary leaders tried to gather resistance, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Marx describes the assembly's reaction with bitter humor: men who had imagined themselves as guardians of the Republic suddenly found themselves powerless, talking in empty halls, proclaiming resistance no one could enforce. The coup revealed a simple but devastating truth. The assembly had laws, but Bonaparte had soldiers. In moments like this, the outcome is rarely in doubt. 5. The people respond and the streets speak. The immediate reaction of the public was mixed, revealing the complexity Marx highlights throughout his analysis. The bourgeoisie. They were shocked but silent. They feared instability more than dictatorship. They disliked Bonaparte but feared workers more. A coup seemed dangerous but another revolution seemed worse. The workers. Some opposed the coup passionately. Small uprisings broke out in several areas, especially among Republicans and Socialists. But the repression of 1848 had shattered their organization. They lacked leadership, arms, and coordination. The peasants. They supported Bonaparte overwhelmingly. The coup seemed like a distant event, and the name Bonaparte still evoked protection and national pride. They believed he was defending their rights against corrupt politicians in Paris. The army. The army obeyed. Bonaparte had spent months strengthening ties with officers. The Napoleonic legend had deep roots. Soldiers believed they were helping restore order. Thus, resistance to the coup never reached critical mass. Parisian barricades appeared, but they were isolated, outnumbered, and crushed. Rural France did not rise. Cities beyond Paris remained mostly quiet. The coup was not just successful, it faced surprisingly little sustained opposition. Marx explains why. The Republic had lost the loyalty of the masses long before Bonaparte ended it. 6. The aftermath. A dictatorship rises from the ashes. After dissolving the assembly, Bonaparte held a nationwide referendum, a classic authoritarian tactic. The question was simple. Should Louis Napoleon be given the authority to establish a new constitution? The results were manufactured through propaganda, intimidation, and lack of alternatives. But they were also supported by millions who genuinely believed Bonaparte could deliver stability. More than 7 million voted yes. Fewer than 700,000 voted no. With this, Louis Bonaparte gained a veneer of democratic legitimacy. Then, 1 year later in 1852, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. The Second Republic was dead. The Second Empire was born. Marx captures the deep irony. The country that overthrew a king in 1848 accepted an emperor in 1852. How could this happen? Marx's answer is clear. The working class was suppressed. The bourgeoisie feared socialism more than despotism. The peasants idolized the Napoleonic name. The assembly divided itself. And the military supported the man who offered glory. History did not repeat as tragedy or farce by accident. It repeated because the conditions were ripe. 7. Marx's final lesson. The anatomy of political failure. In the final pages of the 18th Brumaire, Marx steps back and analyzes the deeper meaning of the coup. He is not simply describing how Bonaparte succeeded. He is explaining why the Republic failed. His insight is profound. 1. A republic without a strong foundation cannot survive. The Second Republic tried to please everyone and satisfied no one. 2. A divided ruling class weakens itself. The assembly spent more energy fighting its internal factions than governing. 3. Fear is a poor substitute for leadership. The bourgeoisie obsessed over suppressing workers, not strengthening democracy. 4. A president with popular support can overwhelm parliament, especially when the parliament lacks moral authority. 5. History does not automatically move forward. Revolution does not guarantee progress. Societies can regress. The ultimate lesson is haunting. Political systems collapse not when they are attacked from the outside, but when they fall apart from the inside. Louis Bonaparte did not overthrow a strong republic. He toppled a fragile one. 8. The curtain falls and the farce is complete. Marx concludes with one of the most famous lines in political theory. History repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. The tragedy was the rise of Napoleon I in 1799, a military genius reshaping Europe through war. The farce was the rise of Napoleon III in 1851, an imitator who lacked the brilliance but exploited the nostalgia. Yet Marx's point goes deeper. He is not mocking the French people. He is reminding us that societies, when tired and disillusioned, often reach back into the past for comfort, even if the symbols they revive bring new chains. The coup of 1851 was a turning point, not just for France, but for modern political history. It showed how democracies can slide into authoritarianism through legal mechanisms, propaganda, and the apathy of exhausted citizens. It demonstrated how class conflict, if unmanaged, creates openings for ambitious individuals. It revealed the dangers of political fragmentation, disunity, and fear. And it proved that a republic without strong institutions, deep public support, and unity of purpose can be swept away by a man who seems unimpressive until the moment he takes power. Marx's work ends, but its lessons remain painfully relevant. The coup of 1851 is not simply French history. It is a warning for all times.